Hi there, and welcome inside the Adorama Live Theater for today's installment of the WCBS Conversation. I'm Alex Silverman, and we're here today to talk about something that affects just about every single one of us, and that's how we get around. Whether you walk or you bike or you take the train or you drive a car, this man sitting next to me has probably thought a lot more about your commute over the years than you have. Not many people are known by a word that he himself coined, especially a word in your case that evokes such a strong feeling in so many of us. Gridlock Sam Schwartz, great to have you here.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to be here.
You're a pretty familiar figure around New York, but for those who don't know, Sam started as a junior engineer in the city's traffic department in 1971, went on to become traffic commissioner, chief engineer for the transportation department. These days he runs Sam Schwartz Engineering, which employs more than 100 people in offices from New York to Washington to Tampa to Los Angeles. He's written more than 200 professional papers, presentations about traffic engineering. He writes a column for the Daily News, and his latest book is called Street Smarts: The Rise of Cities and the Fall of Cars. A lot of our listeners and viewers are probably perking up when they hear that title, but we'll get to that a little bit later on, because before we talk about what happens in the future, I want to talk about how we got to where we are today. You grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn. You write in the book about playing stickball out on the street. What did streets mean to you? How did they impact your development and get you into this, to where you are today?
Well, the streets were the playgrounds. We didn't have very many parks, particularly in Bensonhurst or in Brownsville, where I lived beforehand. And the streets were everything to us. It's where all the kids met. You didn't have any prearranged settings, no parents shuttling you back and forth. You invented games. If it was stickball, older kids taught you that game, or we created, and I was instrumental in the 83rd Street Olympics, and we created our own game. So it had that kind of ingenuity that you needed as a kid without all the structured play, but also you had far fewer cars. But what began to happen is my friends on 83rd Street all began to leave me and move to Los Angeles and the suburbs. All my siblings moved away, and then my beloved Brooklyn Dodgers moved to the West Coast, and the Giants moved to San Francisco. So I was left behind, a city kid. I stayed in the city and still live in the city and raised my family in the city, never gave up on it. But it also formed me those years, and I think it formed a lot of people. Some people it formed their basis in the suburbs and some in the city. And you became a New York City cabbie at some point. That must have given you a different perspective or added to your perspective on the streets. Yeah, I was studying physics in college, and I needed to work during that period of time, so I drove a cab. I drove at Summers, and then when I came back from graduate school, I was unemployed for a while, and I employed myself driving a cab. So when you first got to the traffic department in the early 70s, what was the focus like? I'd imagine, a lot more on cars than it is today. It was almost entirely on moving cars faster, traffic signal patterns that got cars to move even faster than they were moving on the city streets. Highways being widened, the Bruckner interchange was being completed in those years. We were still looking at other kinds of highways through New York City. We widened lanes, widened roadways, anything we could do to make the car move faster, one-way avenues, one-way streets, and that was the emphasis. And that is such a natural way of thinking, that if you want to relieve congestion, you expand, you build more lanes, you build more highways. But you pretty much knew all along, and as most transportation people know now, that doesn't really work. Why is that? It doesn't work for a variety of reasons, but density is one of them. If you imagine you're going to the World Trade Center and everybody wants an individual elevator to go up, it just doesn't work. So if you look at it laterally, that's what we have. People want to take that individual car into Manhattan or wherever they're going, and we just don't have enough room. It's a matter of physics. And so we need to reduce the number of cars. What I've noticed, the cities that seem to be doing it the best have a car share of about 25%. The cities that are not doing it well, like Los Angeles or most other places around the United States, have a car share of about 90% or even higher for most of their trips.
What is it here in New York?
So in New York City, it's about 50% come in by automobile into Manhattan. Elsewhere in Nassau County, it's hitting 80, 90% of trips are made by automobile.
So back then in the 70s when you first got into it, how hard was it to get anything done? Because you said you had to commit acts of low-level sabotage to do anything. I mean, what are you willing to admit to now that you did back then?
Okay, well, I really wanted to work for the transit agency, the New York City Transit Authority at the time, and I wanted to make subways move faster and buses move better, and that was my real interest. And I could not get a job with the Transit Authority, so I landed at what I thought at the time was probably the enemy, and that was the traffic department. So I began doing things as a junior engineer. As a junior engineer, you, in many ways, have the most power because when there are construction drawings, the final drawings for the last check are done by the junior engineers. And so if you draw a red line, a curb moves. If you draw an X, a ramp may disappear. And so I lived in Prospect Lefferts Garden, and so I closed an exit to Prospect Park, and grass started to grow by that exit. I widened the sidewalks on Washington Street and other streets in the area. I eliminated a turn at Empire Boulevard, and I began doing that around the city.
You did these without anybody else's approval?
Nobody's approval.
So when did you see things start to shift toward other modes of transportation, you know, coming into focus? For a couple of generations at least, we were so focused on the car. When did you start to see a transition?
So, you know, post-World War II, we declined in transit usage just about every year, and that continued through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. Ed Koch became mayor in 1978. He appointed a very enlightened deputy commissioner who found me, the saboteur within the traffic department, and vaulted me to assistant commissioner. It was around the same time that Dick Ravitch and a number of other people began to recognize that you had to turn around the transit system, that it was in such a state of decay. So we had a Department of Transportation that was far more enlightened. We had an MTA that had a plan finally, a capital plan. The city had gone broke in '77 and had no capital money. So it really started in the 1980s. We began experimenting with a number of very pro-transit alternatives. We had exclusive lanes on the LIE and the BQE. The LIE started in the 70s, the BQE in the 1980s. Madison Avenue had a double bus lane in the 1980s. And so that began that whole program, and then the city got into the capital phase, and then it kind of peaked with Mayor Bloomberg and Jeanette Sadekhan, and a lot of it is continuing with Polly Trottenberg, the new commissioner.
You were ahead of your time in the 80s because you tried to put in bike lanes and Ed Koch ripped them out, right?
Oh, yes, that was one of my saddest moments. I remember thinking in 1980 that, you know, putting in those bike lanes, that if they lasted till 2000, people would say, boy, Schwartz was prescient. He really knew what he was doing. Well, they didn't make it to 2000. They didn't even make it to November of 1980. Within 2 months, the mayor ordered me to take it out. He called me to his office. He said, everyone is complaining about these bike lanes. Nobody's using them. People are riding the wrong way that do use them. They're running red lights. And he said, everybody, cab drivers, everybody complains to me. In fact, I was in the back of the president's limousine. The president at the time was Jimmy Carter, and the governor at the time was Hugh Carey, and they're riding up 6th Avenue in the presidential limousine, and Hugh Carey turns to the president and says, Mr. President, look out the window and see how Ed is pissing away your money on these bike lanes. So that's when Ed Koch said, take it out.
And now we have Citi Bike, and when that came into play about 3 years ago, there were all these predictions, all these inexperienced bikers are going to hit the road, and you know, horrible things are going to happen, and cars are going to hit them. We didn't see any of that. Why was that?
Well, first of all, I was taken by surprise in terms of the usage. I thought it's a good idea. I had no idea it would be so successful, and it solved a problem that New Yorkers have had forever, and that's the crosstown problem. Suddenly you can hop on the bike and get crosstown. I think biking in the city just isn't as dangerous as a lot of people think. I mean, there are places where you wouldn't want to ride, but there's also been a lot of bike lanes that are installed. 8th Avenue has an almost complete bike lane, 9th Avenue, 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue. Some of the cross streets have bike lanes. So that helped as well, and greater awareness. Some studies have shown the more bikes on the street, the more drivers are aware of bikes and prepared to drive in such a fashion.
And I think I saw one study that said as the number of bikes on the streets increases, the number of injuries sustained by people on bikes goes down. So I guess drivers are aware, bikers are more aware of their surroundings as you get just a bigger infrastructure around it.
Exactly. Otherwise, the lone biker is the surprise on the road. But
Right.
when it's a sea of bike riders and near the studios here, if you ride on Prince Street into Charlton Street, now you will see a long line of bike riders.
Vision Zero was a term that was sort of a buzzword in transportation circles for a while, and it came into sort of the general consciousness when Mayor de Blasio made it his umbrella term for all of his efforts to make the streets safer. But it refers to zero traffic fatalities, bringing the number down to none. How realistic is that? I know some cities have gotten pretty close.
Yeah, some cities have gotten pretty close. Barcelona is down to 10 pedestrian fatalities or fewer a year, and it's a city about the third or a quarter the size of New York City. And
It's a few hundred in New York.
Yeah,
right?
we have far more. So cities have shown that if they reduce the number of motor vehicles on the road, that instantly changes the equation and fewer people are killed in crashes. We're going to have much safer cars. And those cars already have detection devices to let you know if a pedestrian is in your path. There's also braking devices that are being linked. And then, of course, what's coming in a very big way are autonomous vehicles. And autonomous vehicles tend to be safer. However, I caution people, autonomous vehicles can cause more congestion. And there are health risks with them if we decide that we're not going to walk anymore. And you can look at communities and look at the land use and the transit usage, and you can predict the obesity level, the diabetes level, and the cardiovascular level. So autonomous vehicles are wonderful in one way, and the other way, if they make us lazier and we all look like those people in the film Wall-E, we're in trouble.
One of the big advantages to taking the train is that you can get things done while you're riding it. If you're commuting in from the suburbs, rather than driving, you can actually get some productive stuff done. If all of a sudden people say, I can get in my autonomous car and do the same thing, that might be a problem.
It's a real problem because, again, the numbers don't work. If the advent of the autonomous vehicle is for driver-only vehicles and people use it the way they use cars today, it's a loser. Cities will be overloaded. Just imagine somebody coming to visit you at the studios here and they can't find a parking spot. They come up for an interview and they tell their car, oh, just drive around.
Right. Yeah.
And they'll do things like that because the parking is so expensive. So we're really worried. Just about every study has shown if we allow autonomous vehicles to replace cars, then we're going to see far more traffic congestion. If we allow transit vehicles to be autonomous, then we're going to see less congestion and more people could be served, and it could be dynamically responsive to the needs of the passengers.
Speaking of the number of cars out on the streets, any conversation about Uber in this city is loaded with all kinds of political stuff. But in your unbiased opinion, does Uber's growth affect congestion in this city? Has it?
Yeah. First of all, I'm an Uber user, I'm a Via user. I think these are really good technologies. However, a lot of caution. It does affect other industries, and so we have just as many taxis out there that we had before. You add the Uber vehicles are waiting, and if they're waiting, they're often in no parking zones, and other cars double park. If they're circulating while they're waiting for you, the result is more of these on-demand vehicles, more traffic congestion. Traffic has gotten worse. I don't believe the studies that say there's no relationship between these new on-demand vehicles and traffic congestion.
And a lot of people who take Uber are presumably people who would take mass transit otherwise.
That's right. There hasn't been a really good study of who the Uber rider is, and that's what's lacking. I was really surprised when I saw the report done by the city, at least the little bit that was released, didn't seem to indicate where people came from, the vehicle miles traveled, made suppositions that they replaced the taxi trips so the vehicles were there anyhow. but they didn't look at the total number of vehicles in motion. And in the 1980s, I studied that and found that's the closest correlation to vehicle speeds.
Let's talk a little about millennials, because they're having a huge impact on cities and the focus of transportation in cities. How big a factor are millennials in the decision-making about transportation today?
I think it's huge, and I think it's radical, and it's nothing short of a revolution. I've been watching traffic, if you add my cab driving days, for half century now in New York City, and I've watched traffic volumes. I've been monitoring them in the United States and New York City for 45 years. And I've watched it go up every year. And if you go back to 1900, it went up every single year. Occasionally there'd be a dip for the 1929 crash, World War II, but immediately afterwards, shot straight up. The fuel crises of 73, 79, then shot up. Something happened around 2003, 2004 that no one predicted. No one could take credit for it, at least no individual could take credit for it. Suddenly, vehicle miles traveled, the way we measure vehicle usage in the United States, peaked. And then it went down for 10 straight years. And that really sparked my book, Street Smart, The Rise of Cities and the Fall of Cars. I began looking at what happened. And it turns out not every American stopped driving. But of millennials, they were driving 20 to 25% fewer miles than young people, the previous young people that turned of age for driving. That's an incredible statistic.
Is that because cities have become more attractive to people? They want to live in cities with these kinds of options?
There was no one reason. I'd say the single reason that showed up the most is lifestyle. And a lot of the millennials kind of eschew the lifestyle that a lot of them grew up with, sitting in the back of a car, watching two angry parents. They are not enamored as much as previous generations with escaping the city and going to the suburbs. So many of them are moving from the suburbs into the city. They like being able to walk to a store, walk to entertainment, go to a movie theater, or get on transit. They also are very health conscious. And they recognize if they can incorporate a physical activity with their commute, they will be a lot healthier. So they bike to work, they walk to work. Even taking transit results in walking 20% more than if you didn't take transit. So, and you're going up steps if you're riding the subways. I average at least 10 flights a day going up and down staircases when I'm riding the subway.
So the whole, settle down, move to the suburbs, white picket fence sort of mentality, that's going out the window.
It's not going out the window. And I get criticized a lot when I've been touring on the book, because I was on a Calgary radio station and a person called in and said, I don't know where this guy, what's he thinking about, but I have 3 kids who are all driving SUVs or, pickup trucks. The majority of young people still are driving. But a shift of 20%, going from 90% to 70%, is amazing. If it continues, it changes everything. Changes the whole formula, makes cities a lot stronger. And there's so much evidence now that cities are getting stronger. Lifespan in New York City is now greater than it is in the suburbs and a number of other places, which wasn't the case when we had lots of pollution. Economy is booming. If you look at GDP and you look at the number of transit riders, GDP rises with the number of transit riders, and it's inversely related to driving. The same thing with venture capital money, which is what I call where the brains are, where the brains go. The venture capitalists are spending the money in places where there's a lot of transit usage and very little driving. Almost a perfect correlation. So
when you think about it, and you point this out in the book, the future looks a lot like the past. Civilizations developed around dense cities, and then they spread out over, a couple of generations, and now it's coming back.
Yeah, exactly. It's only for 100 years of civilization did we think the car was the answer. And now a lot of people are looking at a more balanced approach. We destroyed our transit systems in city after city in the United States, not worldwide. A lot of places in Europe kept good transit systems. Some places in Asia have been building really good transit systems. In the United States, Los Angeles at one time had one of the best transit systems in the world. If you look at Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you'll see the detective is asked why he doesn't own a car and why he rides transit. He says, a car in LA? It's got the best transit system in the world. But we destroyed that. We, the United States, we went city after city, including New York, getting rid of all of our streetcars. And that's why I'm calling for us to rethink streetcars. The best, the smartest cities have multiple modes of transportation. You look at Zurich, one of the smartest cities, and they have every form of transportation, from streetcars to buses to ferries to a car share of probably under 25%. That's the right kind of city. It doesn't mean banning cars, but it means managing motor vehicles and offering people the best alternatives.
And you've been involved in this Brooklyn-Queens streetcar project that the mayor announced a couple of weeks ago. Do you see that kind of thing popping up in more places, more transit-poor neighborhoods in the city?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that the mayor has embraced the plan, and it's really becoming the de Blasio streetcar plan. One of the very interesting things is it's along the waterfront, and the waterfront was not a place you'd want to live 50 years ago. So what did we do 50, 60 years ago? We put our poorest residents in housing projects along the waterfront. So this streetcar goes right by 13 housing projects. So it's a great equalizer. It picks up a lot of people of low income. You have a number of hipsters and others that are moving into these areas of somewhat higher income, and you even have some high income people living along the Brooklyn waterfront. It's been shown that the transit systems that work the best are the ones that appeal to the spectrum of income levels. And in fact, I devote a chapter in my book called Tuxedos on the Subway.
When you mentioned hipsters, you reminded me of something in the book, an episode about the Williamsburg Bridge. I think the hipsters have you to thank for the modern-day Williamsburg, because you essentially saved the Williamsburg Bridge because they were going to build another one right through where hipster Williamsburg is right now, right?
In the mid-1980s, the city had no money. The Williamsburg Bridge was corroding, and there was a belief that it would collapse and have to be closed by 1995. Eventually, I had to shut the entire bridge down because it was in danger of collapse. And the federal government, which had the big money bags, said, we're not going to rebuild this bridge. You have two blighted communities on either side of the bridge. The old bridge is substandard, has narrow lanes, has low clearance for trucks, has no shoulders. We want a nice, big, wide highway crossing the East River, modern structure. And they were going to take swaths of Williamsburg because they saw no value in what was in Williamsburg. They saw no value in the Lower East Side. And I fought.
If only they knew.
I fought them, and I was able to show how I could save the bridge. I told them I didn't want a wider bridge. We didn't want more cars in Manhattan. I showed the old bridge actually was quite safe, that the places where the lanes were the narrowest were the safest part of the bridge, and ultimately convinced the feds. It was a long, drawn-out battle, and so the neighborhoods of Williamsburg, the Lower East Side, were saved. I had no idea what they'd become, and now it's extraordinary. Williamsburg means something all across the United States. People say we want to build another Williamsburg here. Didn't mean that in the 1980s.
So if you live at North 7th in Bedford right now, you should probably send Sam a thank you note after you watch this. You've seen what's happening in so many cities around the country. You've even gone to North Korea to consult with them there. How did that come about?
Yeah, through underground channels, some people in South Korea who really believe in unification of the Koreas. There are people in North Korea that also are looking for peace. And a meeting was arranged in Beijing with the viceroy or the infrastructure chief, and I could not believe the common themes that we were looking at. Ecology, big transit systems, the airports that they wanted to build, but they just did not have the know-how. And they really were welcoming of Americans. They feasted me at a banquet, and it was extraordinary. I think they didn't trust the Chinese, although we were in China at the time. But nothing came of it. Right after that, Kim Jong-un passed away and Kim Jong-il took over, unless I'm getting it backwards,
Right.
and that came to an end.
So if you look at where we are right now in New York, what do you see? What kind of New York do you see 20, 30 years down the line? If you had to predict it, what would we have now, or what would we have then that we don't have now?
Well, I'm hoping we're going to be smart. And if we're going to be smart, we're going to have pricing for our most precious space, and that's the streets of Manhattan. And just use the capitalist approach. And I have the Move New York plan, which on Thursday we're going to get a lot of support from a lot of elected officials. I'm hoping that we start to realize that we can't just allow as many vehicles in as possible, that we have to have a strategy to control that. That also gives us a nice revenue base, and we would improve our transit system. We also should be looking at formulas like what the Brooklyn-Queens streetcar is looking at and what we did with the extension of the number 7 line, and that's value capture. The real estate industry, the real estate developers, they make a lot of money when transit systems are built. And so and I find a willingness among the real estate industry to say, yes, we will help finance a lot of this transit. When you look at the subways that have been built in New York City, you look at Queens Boulevard, what it looked like before the subway, and it was empty. And real estate developers helped build that. The same thing with the B line, the D line in Brooklyn. It was real estate that built our transit systems. Now, I also see pedestrian bike bridges, finally building another East River Bridge, at least 2 East River bridges going from Brooklyn to Governor's Island to Lower Manhattan, and another one going from Long Island City to the Technion campus, Cornell Technion on Roosevelt Island, and then going into Midtown Manhattan, because the biking percentage should go up to 6%, 10% of the people. People should be walking at another 10% to get to our central business district. We need to solve our truck problems. There should be some more rail. We should be looking at the Belt Parkway to accept trucks. We have to rebuild the Belt Parkway. So that's part of my vision. There's other plans called the Brooklyn-Queens, the Triborough RX that goes using rail right-of-way going from Brooklyn to Queens to the Bronx, activating Metro North lines as well going into Grand Central. We have to finish the Gateway Tunnel. So it's a big list.
You say in the book that it's a myth that we need trillions of dollars investment in our infrastructure. Why is that a myth, considering all of what you just said? We need so much to make your vision come to pass.
Yeah, we do need billions, and we still need trillions in the country, but it's how we rate the infrastructure in the United States and where the infrastructure money goes. More of the money is still going to highways. In Houston, they built the Katy Freeway to 26 lanes, and it still has congestion. The way the federal
26 lanes?
Yes, 26 lanes. The federal government, what it does even the American Society of Civil Engineers, when it says we need trillions, they say, well, these facilities are substandard because the lanes aren't wide enough. But there's been no proof. In fact, the opposite has been shown, that they're not less safe. They also say we need wider shoulders, that if the traffic is congested, we need more lanes, when in fact it's been shown the more lanes you provide, the more congestion you create, the fewer lanes, the less congestion. So we don't need to invest in a number of the highway projects that are out there at a cost of about $1 trillion. We should be tearing down some highways. We tore down, I was the engineer that ultimately tore down the West Side Highway, and now we don't have to maintain it anymore.
And when it fell down, everybody thought, where's the traffic going to go?
Right,
and
yes.
it didn't go we didn't need it. It turned out we didn't need it.
Yeah, and in New York City, we had plans for a cross Midtown Expressway and the Lower Manhattan Expressway. If they were built today, we would say, how could we survive without them? Well, we stopped those from being built. John Lindsay was the mayor at the time and stopped Robert Moses. And Soho, which would have been destroyed, which would have never been Soho, would have been the path of the Lower Manhattan Expressway. And Midtown, the southern Midtown, would have been the path of the other expressway. We don't need as many highways. We could save a ton of money, $1 trillion, by no longer investing in widening highways, in building new highways, in bringing them up to standards that haven't been shown to provide any increase in safety, just move more vehicles.
I want to go back to one of the first things you mentioned, which is the Move New York plan, the congestion pricing element, because that is certainly not something new. It's something that has been brought up in different forms throughout the years. Mayor Bloomberg got behind it, and eventually Albany wasn't on board. What do you think has changed, or has anything changed, as far as whether or not that could ever happen?
Yeah, I've been at it for 45 years. I worked on the John Lindsay plan, which got actually further than any other plan. I worked on Ed Koch's plan, and I certainly supported the Bloomberg plan. What I've done is I've spent a lot of time with the opponents to the Bloomberg plan and listened to them. And they felt they were already paying too much in tolls. And so in the Move New York plan, we lower all of the tolls outside Manhattan Central Business District. So the Throgsneck Bridge, the Whitestone Bridge, the Triborough Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, $5 off round trip. The Rockaway bridges, slashing them by 40 to 50%. Every bridge in the Bronx gets slashed. The five toll bridges in Queens get slashed. 2 in Brooklyn get slashed. We return tolls to the East River bridges, which are all built with tolls. And in 1911, Mayor Gaynor removed the tolls from the bridges. We bring those tolls back. We set them at the same level that the people are paying at the Throgsneck Bridge today or at the Midtown Tunnel. And we do the same thing for people coming south of 60th Street.
And those are the bridges where there are alternate transit options as opposed to the other ones where there are not, right?
That's exactly right. Somebody riding the Throgsneck Bridge and having to pay $11.08 in Easy Pass, $16 in cash for a round trip has no subway alternative. The truckers are paying $86, soon going up to $90 and $100 by 2020. They have no subway alternate. They have to take those facilities. So we slash trucking costs in Brooklyn, Queens, in Long Island, Bronx by some 30 to 40%. It's just extraordinary. But for driving into the Central Business District, we try to set some speed goals to guarantee people reliability. We also eliminate the crazy system we have right now in which if you drive through Manhattan on your way to New Jersey, say you're a trucker on Flatbush Avenue and you're going to Newark Airport, you go over the Manhattan Bridge for free, you travel the streets of Lower Manhattan, bouncing along those streets. Occasionally somebody gets killed on those streets. You go out to Holland, or the bigger trucks go out the Lincoln Tunnel,
you don't pay anything. And
you pay $0. But if you go out the Verrazano Bridge, where you should be on those roads, you'll pay $86, soon to be $100. So we have a crazy system. We could do better. We're only doing that based on some history and not any logic.
So in your conversations with folks in Albany who opposed it, are you more confident now that this will actually happen sometime soon?
Yes, I believe that this will happen. If it doesn't happen this time around, although I'm somewhat optimistic, a lot of elected officials have signed on to it, then it's going to happen. You know, we're just not going to be able to do what we've done for 46 years now, which is, or actually 48 years, what was set up by Nelson Rockefeller in 1968, saying every time the MTA needs money, we're going to toll the people in the Rockaways. We're going to toll the people in Staten Island. We're going to toll the people in Throgsneck and Whitestone. It can't go up any further. It's $16 cash. What is it going to go up to 20? Already politicians are saying that's enough. Well, you need a plan. We can't let the transit system deteriorate.
And to think if John Lindsay hadn't gotten cold feet, you already had the signs printed up, right?
To
keep
ban cars
out of Midtown?
That's right.
Well, the book is called The Rise of Cities and the Fall of Cars. You don't believe we could actually go completely without cars ever, though, right?
No. There are some people with disabilities. There are some people that will be very stubborn and never get out of their cars. But we can get down to the 20 to 25% modal share by car, and I think that that's fine.
Sam Schwartz, thank you so much.
Alex, great to be here.
Appreciate it. This is the WCBS Conversation from the Adorama Live Theater. Thanks so much for watching.